Well, welcome everyone to this event. I am John Ikenberry, the director of the Reimagining World Order project at Princeton, which is part of the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies, PIIRS. And it's a great pleasure today to welcome Richard Falk back to Princeton to discuss his new political memoir, as he describes it. As you know, Professor Falk has had an extraordinary career as a scholar, a public intellectual, an activist on the global stage in so many different ways, a UN Human Rights Commissioner. So there is quite a story here that we want to talk about today. Richard spent 40 years at Princeton as the Albert G. Milbank Professor in the Politics Department and the Woodrow Wilson School, teaching international law and politics. He's the author of over 50 books and untold articles ranging widely. I'll just mention a few things. His early work on international law and the Vietnam War, very much groundbreaking work. Major statements on environmentalism and planetary peril, including the book, This Endangered Planet, which this is actually the copy from my college days. My very first course in international relations, we read the book. So it makes me feel like I've been around a while. And pioneering work on, in his leadership of the World Order Models Project, his book, The Study of Future Worlds. I also have that here, a very important, influential book for many of us, including for the project that I'm now heading here at PIIRS. Books on human rights, social justice, nuclear weapons, and the search for a livable world. A truly impossible career and life story to summarize, but we're going to try to at least scratch the surface today. And so we have four friends who are going to join Richard to reflect on these decades. Anne-Marie Slaughter, the president of the New America Foundation, former dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, earlier a student of Richard's at Princeton as an undergraduate. Dan Deudney, professor at Johns Hopkins, who did his PhD here, and Richard was one of his advisors. Zia Mian, who is a research scholar here at Princeton, had worked with Richard on nuclear weapons issues. And last but not least, Mary Kaldor, director or professor of global governance at the LSE, who has worked with Richard over many decades on issues of war and peace and justice. I also will recognize Tolya Levshin and Chika Tanuka, who are my team here at Princeton as part of the Reimagining World Order project. Richard, welcome again. So glad to have you here, at least virtually. We are hoping that you might give us 15 or 20 minutes of thoughts on your memoir, and then I will inflict 4 of your friends on you. So, Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, John, and I apologize for the logistical problems that beset my entry onto this link. But I thank you very much for the introductory words, and I appreciate particularly their excessiveness, which I am trying to process at the moment. And I'm very grateful to the 4 very distinguished discussants who took the time to take part in this event. I must say, writing a political memoir is not something to take on lightly. I never would have done it had I known the difficulties along the path. It's the most difficult thing I ever attempted to write. And it's difficult because you are constantly navigating between being as truthful as possible and sparing others any hurt or misjudgment. And it's that navigating those interfaces between the personal, the professional, and the political that I found most treacherous, I guess, in the process of doing it. I decided as a strategy to, uh, to do a memoir based on what I could recollect. In other words, I never consulted any books or even my own journals, which I had fairly detailed journals of my meetings with important people over the years and these trips I took to combat zones and things. But and it would have been a different book had I done a more reconstructed life rather than, I make the distinction between a recollected life and a reconstructed life. And I'm not sure that was, I'm not sure which of the books would have been more accurate or more insightful, illuminating. I think this is more readable probably because it came from, it came without any academic apparatus, and I didn't attempt to deal with scholarly issues at all. One of the things that I wondered about as I wrote this was how I became what I became. In other words, I grew up in a very typical middle-class Manhattan atmosphere, and yet I'm different than anyone else I've known that had that similar background. And that persisted in my later life, including at Princeton, where I was always felt on the margins, both academically and politically. Academically, because I was explicitly normative in my undertaking, my work, and focused less on the immediate than on longer range conceptions of what the world could be and might be. In other words, I was always interested in exploring what the human potential was for a better world. And that grew out of my, some of my academic work at, especially at Harvard, I think. And it made me, it put me at a distance from mainstream realism, which was definitely the prevailing current at Princeton and elsewhere. And yet I didn't feel that what I was doing was utopian. It was, it seemed to me linked to the present urgencies and to a more desirable future that was within human potential. It was, as the future is unknowable, we can dwell on what it means to cope with uncertainty. And my feeling about uncertainty, about the unknowability of the future, was to seek what I believed was right. In other words, since you can't know what will happen, it seemed to me practical and ethically desirable to seek the best possible future. And I've always tried to be guided by that. And so this course of my life experience had a lot of accidents, important accidents in it. Because when I went to law school with the idea of not being a lawyer, and my father was a lawyer, Wall Street lawyer, and a naval historian, and he also was a very conservative influence on my early life, but I didn't know what, my academic awakening was so late that I didn't know what else to do but to go to law school after I finished undergraduate, as an undergraduate at the university. And then when I went to law school, I went to Yale, and I made a big effort to take all the courses that would make me unhirable when I graduated. And I did a good job of that. But when I finished, one of the things I did, which was highly impractical, even by Yale standards, was to spend a lot of time studying the law of India. And I had a Fulbright when I graduated, but the State Department, in their wisdom, canceled the Fulbright program that year because India hadn't paid for PL 480 wheat. And this was to be a punishment that they would deprive India of Fulbright scholars. They renewed it the next year, but by then my father was terminally ill, and I never took it. But because I was unemployed at that stage, and someone got sick on the faculty at Ohio State, and they were so desperate that they hired me. They found me and hired me. And I had never thought of academic life as an option for myself, because I'd always struggled academically, and it wasn't in my imaginary. But as soon as I got there to Columbus, Ohio, not a very hospitable place actually, I immediately knew that it was a good existential fit for me, that it allowed me to do what I was interested in. There was no effective person commanding my actions. It seemed to me a very privileged life, and I never lost that feeling through all the years I spent at Ohio State and then Princeton, and now marginally at the University of California and at Queen Mary University in London. So that was a huge accident, that I had the opportunity to teach for an academic position immediately after law school, and I couldn't have had that had I followed my chosen path. And then I was also lucky about the Princeton chair, because it was vacant for some years. They searched for somebody that had this peculiar combination of being trained in law but not too interested in it, and they couldn't find anyone that could get by the tenure requirements at Princeton. And so not only was it empty, but it had accumulated a lot of money in the process of staying empty. And so I always had the benefit of research assistance and travel budget and so on, from a very early age. And so it eliminated any of the usual anxieties that young faculty have. And that was very helpful in allowing me to take maximum advantage of being at a university with excellent resources and excellent students and so on. And at the same time, I had at Princeton, particularly, I think, difficulties reconciling my scholarly life with my activist impulses. And my activist impulses, it wasn't that there was an absence of activism at Princeton, but it was activism from above, going to Washington to speak to important people, or testifying in Congress, or consulting, and so on. It wasn't the activism of the street, activism from below. And it was when I became involved with the anti-war movement of the Vietnam anti-war movement, I was very active in that way that was frowned upon by many of my faculty colleagues. And I remember Carl Kazin, who was then the director of the Institute for Advanced Studies, and whom I had known for quite a long time, and he knew I was a very good friend of Nick Katzenbach at the time, and he said, "Why don't you stop talking to the rabble and go take a train to Washington and talk to Nick Katzenbach?" And that's just an illustration of advice that I was quite often given. And I recount in the memoir somewhere that the only time I have ever been in the Pentagon was prior to going to Hanoi in 1968, when Mort Halpern and Leslie Gelb were important young officials in the Pentagon, and they knew I was going to go to on this trip because Dick Ullman, who was a friend of theirs, was on leave at the Pentagon that year and he told them, and I decided I would learn something by seeing what these people thought. They in turn wanted me to take a letter from the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State to the leadership in Hanoi, but they placed not speak publicly against the war ever again. And I rejected that condition. I still don't know what was in the letter, and I had no regrets about doing that, but it made me feel maybe I was having some effect by talking more to the street than to Nick Katzenbach, but one will never know. The first visit to Vietnam was very instrumental in changing me from a uncomfortable marginal realist to a more engaged with the struggles of vulnerable and marginalized people, because I saw the war not from above, not as a imprudent form of imprudent foreign policy in the manner that George Kennan and Hans Morgenthau came to see it, but I saw it from the perspective of the people that were victimized by a high technology intervention in a low technology society. And the devastation combined with the beauty of the landscape and the charm of the people and the talent of the leadership all had a very big effect on me. And I had the good fortune there of spending quite a bit of time with the prime minister, who then was eager to negotiate a peace and gave me a set of proposals that were more favorable than what Henry Kissinger negotiated 4 years later, and many lives lost later, and received the Nobel Peace Prize for. In other words, they were ready for an agreement at 4 years earlier that was actually more favorable to the US than what emerged out of the Paris negotiations. So that's the main sort of general comments that I think are of, at least give my sense of what I was attempting to do, and the feeling that maybe a life of this sort could be of interest or help to others who are struggling to find a path of their own that reconciled what they believed in and how to cope with the practical challenges of life, of a responsible adult life. And let me stop here and welcome your reactions.
Thank you, Richard. That's terrific. I'm going to now turn to Anne-Marie, and then we'll go in sequence. And Richard, you'll have a chance to respond. So we'll come back to you in a little bit. But Anne-Marie, do you want to start?
With pleasure. So Richard, first of all, it's wonderful to see you. And when I was asked to do this, even independent of my affection for you and our long relationship, I thought, of course I'm going to do this, because Richard has written a book at 90. And my husband, also an academic at Princeton, and I talk a lot about how as you get older, it's really the life of the mind that continues to sustain you, and a degree of activism as well, but that ability to think and to read and to write is sustaining. It certainly is sustaining, I think, for many of us as any physical sustenance. And in particular, you wrote this wonderful piece at the beginning where you just told us how hard this was, and I can well believe it, but in part because you say writing a memoir has been as much about writing a memoir has been as much about discovering my story, myself, as telling it. In other words, it is a process, particularly as you said, because it's a life recollected, not reconstructed, of discovering who you are. And as you say yourself, you're asking, how did I come to be? And that offers, again, tremendous inspiration, at least for me, as I look ahead. And so I just want to start by saying what a gift you give us, and what an inspiration that at 90 you can be discovering yourself. The other thing that I love about it, and I immediately ran downstairs to read to my husband, was the passage where you talk about walking with the Strindberg trained psychologist and saying that, every decade you've been more satisfied with every decade than the preceding one, right up to being 90. That is not what I think most people think about later life, and I found it deeply inspiring. Notwithstanding that I'm gathering from this that you're no longer on the tennis court, but I thought that was wonderful. And I do want to talk about the intellectual dimensions of some of what you've just talked about. But I want to start actually by saying, in reading what you wrote about me, and I'll summarize that, because you have a wonderful section where you talk about many of your students, at least one of whom was also a student of mine, Asla Bala, and I know you'll be talking with her soon. In reading that, there was an element of discovery that I want to share, because I think it's important to really make clear what your influence has been. So like you, and frankly, I think almost everyone who goes to Yale Law School, and a fair number of people who go to Harvard, I went to law school without any real intention of being a practicing lawyer. But I wanted to be in the State Department. And you knew that as an undergraduate, as you say. You taught me in your graduate course on international law when I was a senior in 1979 or 1980. And in that course, I read Abe Shays' book on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I thought it was the most subtle and practical account of how international law could work in actually shaping behavior without being enforceable. All those issues as international lawyers we debate forever. And so it sent me to Harvard Law School to study with Abe, and Abe became my mentor. So in that sense, the sort of very direct impact that your course had. But I very clearly, as you say, did want to go to law school, but only to be able to get to the State Department. That was the way you went in and out of the State Department. Cy Vance was Secretary of State then. He was the classic way that lawyers did foreign policy. They went to big New York law firms, and they went in and out of the State Department and getting as high as they possibly could. I discovered I didn't want to practice law after one summer at Simpson Thacher, and fell into academia. I'd not known till reading this book that had not been your original plan, because you are a deeply academic but also activist person. I agree that it's not a common combination. But you then write about you hope that I'll still go in. And you describe me as a liberal hawk. And the question, which I think is an important one, the question of whether that was a view, as so many of the people you describe in your book, a view that was tailored to political ambition, meaning that you don't want to stray too far from the beaten path, or something I felt. I want to make the case in both cases you're wrong, and that actually I am much more your student than you've probably ever realized. So I'll start with the interventionism, the arguments about wanting to intervene. And I strongly champion the intervention in Kosovo, and then later in Libya, not Iraq. I only thought we should go into Iraq if the UN agreed, and they weren't going to agree. And it was, but later, Libya, yes. But I've changed my view, and I changed my view partway through Libya, because it was clear to me the disaster for the people on the ground, and particularly for the women, because it was clear to me that we were flooding the zone with guns and small arms. And by then it was clear to me that for the women in particular, and the children, those who were not going to use the guns, but were going to have the guns used against them, this was a disaster. And I would say that was 2013 to 2012. And since then, I think very much in your vein, what ultimately is best for the people in the world is more important than what is best for the states in the world. And I will spend the latter decades of my intellectual life, and Mary was there a long time ago also, but arguing for a much less state-centric view of the international system, a vision of world order that is as grounded in, well, is focused on humanity, but that is grounded in the participation of individuals and other groups and organizations and even businesses as it is states. It took me a while, but my concern from the beginning, starting with Kosovo and Rwanda, was much more Kofi Annan's. that there were interventions that could be undertaken for the sake of humanity, not simply a rationalization, as so many interventions were. I now think, except in the rare case, they're likely to do more harm than good, but I will always wish we had intervened in Rwanda, and we could have. And I'm glad we intervened in Kosovo. But I also want to talk about, I do not want to go into government anymore. And I've left academia to be the head of an organization that connects ideas to action. And there too, I think your path of recognizing that to play the game in Washington, yes, requires selling your soul. We all know that. I mean, you really have to be willing to trim your sails, to change my metaphors. Not always, not completely, but enough so that you can stay connected enough and conventional enough to be appointed to actually have traditional impact. You discovered that early. Your path has been from the beginning one of expanding the ambit of political debate and being willing to really be an outsider. You're wonderful. Your passage on the Council on Foreign Relations and your concern about Bill Bundy being the head of Foreign Affairs, you could still write that today. It was absolutely brilliant. You were willing to not be that insider so that you could really push ideas that were too far ahead of their time for you to get recognition in Washington, but sufficient. But on the other hand, you have inspired generations, and that, in the end, I think it may be the better path. That Washington is a world where you have to be willing to be not completely conventional, but mostly conventional to have impact. And that's a trade-off that I, in the end, am not willing to make. You were not either. I will say, in reading your description of me, which is why I'm going on at such length, a lot of that became even clearer to me because of your sort of assumption of a traditionally ambitious path. I want to close, and I want to hear my fellow panelists by asking you, and I hope you'll answer later. I love the concept of a citizen pilgrim, but I still am not entirely certain what it means, and I hope you'll try to. You don't actually define it. You talk about it, and you are it, but I'd love to hear your definition. It's clearly, though, pilgrim is to journey. And that is critical. You are still learning. You are still shaping yourself. And in that sense, it's a fabulous understanding of how to be a citizen. I would love to hear a little more about that. I also, as it happens, I was reading John Stuart Mill this morning on liberty, and reading, I spend 20 or 30 minutes every morning trying to read some classics. And I was so struck by his point about no matter how far out the view is, we always need to hear it. There is no truth, but in the intersection of conflicting truths. There are things that are more truthful than otherwise. Post-Trump, I do not want to be heard as saying there is no truth. But his point was there's never any perfect truth, and that the dissenting voice is absolutely indispensable. That is not a fashionable view today in many of the progressive circles that you inhabit. I'd love to hear what you think about those tensions. But I want to conclude by saying that you may have been too far ahead of your time for immediate Washington influence, and you may have cast your lot with the world of learning and activism and long-term change. But I think you can say, as you look back at 90 and look at the books that John held up, that you were ahead of your time and you were right in so many ways. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. That's wonderful. Richard, if it's okay, I'm going to go on to Dan, but we're going to come back to you on these questions. I too want to hear about the Citizen Pilgrim idea, which is very evocative. And we've talked a little bit about that on a podcast. And just for those on the line, the program that I run has a series of podcasts, and our very first, shall we say, victim was Richard, who kindly sat for a long interview, which is on the website under a podcast. So next, we're going to turn to Dan. Welcome, Dan. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll pick up really right where Anne-Marie left off about the long-term impact of ideas. And I want to talk about really three: This Endangered Planet, A Study of Future Worlds, and the WAMP project more generally, and underscore their revolutionary character and their continued revolutionary relevance. To start with, This Endangered Planet, 1971, the content is very much focused on environment and the awakening of the 1960s, very much like a whole slew of books. But what this book is different in an important way is that it puts the unit of the planet at the center. It's not world politics, it's not global politics, it's the planet. That it is the human relationship to the planet that is most central. This was, of course, published right alongside the book of your colleagues Harold and Margaret Sprout, Towards a Politics of Planet Earth, and your book and their book are in many ways the beginning, or certainly early landmarks in a movement in IR that has just in most recent years gained steam. My own work in the 80s was very much in the planetary mode and was very marginal, but more recently triggered by the Anthropocene and the general recognition of what was in the future 50 years ago is here now, that the planetary is increasingly being advanced by people in IR, myself among them, as the appropriate unifying and center of gravity for the study of humanity and its activities. The second book that I would like to mention a few points on, your study of future worlds. This was, for me, tremendously influential. It was one of those books that the 10 books that influenced you the most. Here it is. And I might note that one of the features of this work, I think pretty much uniquely among your works, is that you have this terrific set of ideograms where you basically have systematically deployed a visual imagery for what is otherwise an extremely complex argument. And as your student, I have continued to try and do that type of translation, but I certainly would not want to say that that's become mainstream at this point. People are very dismissive of it, although I believe that, as they say, a picture is worth 10,000 words, or maybe at least 500. And so this book, unlike the Endangered Planet book, is in an important way a path that has not been taken, but that should be taken. This book sits way outside the IR of its time, and still outside of the IR of our time now. And I think that IR has been much the worse because of this. And I just to sort of underscore what the important conceptual framing here is, this is the flagship book for the World Order Models Project. And the key move in this book and this project is radically at variance with social science focused on causal analysis, explaining what is. That your colleagues, John and our colleagues today, Mary's colleagues, all of our colleagues and I are still basically doing causal analysis. How did the world come to be? And one of the big problems with this is that the type of knowledge that it produces is often very disconnected with agency, with actors. Doesn't really tell you what to do, doesn't really provide guidance, and makes IR and the study of world politics kind of systemically quasi-relevant. But your book is really, while it's very future-oriented, I see it as very much a restoration of an original vision of political science that was laid out in Aristotle, where political science, the queen of the sciences, is a practical science, and it is modeled after medicine and normative objectives, in the case of the medical analogy, health, but in your model, the 4 world order values are not something that is external to the enterprise, but is actually central to the enterprise. And so knowledge accumulation in this Aristotelian Falkian mode is attempting to look to the future and look at the total range of possibilities, and then ask the question, which world order, which configuration, which arrangement of authorities actually services most effectively or adequately effectively the values, the goals. This is a model of political science which, as I noted, and it's obvious, is not hegemonic today, but its revolutionary potential and its relevance is greater today in many ways than it even was then, given the stakes that we have in front of us today. And my third observation is about your World Order Models Project more generally. And this is something that should be seen and recognized as a pioneering moment on something that has become quite large, which is a truly global conversation. People write articles stating things like international relations and American social science, international relations, a European social science. And your project, this project, and I know that you were just the leader of it, there were others as well, was an important moment in the broadening of the conversation. Because as best I can tell, this is the first time that we actually have a serious engagement among scholars from all corners of the world. You're not writing about, Africa. There is an African sitting at the table laying out an African perspective on world order, similarly Latin America and so forth. And so I think that the World Order Models Project, while not talked much about today, was a revolutionary step into something that has become very big and that needs to continue to become big. So in these 3 ways, I want to praise and acknowledge your brilliant and revolutionary work, the potential of which is still very much with us.
Thank you, Dan. That's wonderful. I'm going to turn directly to Zia. Do you want to take the floor? And I'm keeping an eye on the clock, but we're going to keep moving here.
Oh, thank you, John. Like Anne-Marie and Dan, I'm very pleased that Dick has written this book. And I think that, having a conversation about how to imagine and reimagine your own life and the life of the times in which you find yourself and the choices you make with regard to the world as it encounters you is actually very important, especially now. And so let me, try and be short, but make 3 observations. The first is that I was struck by the closest you come, I think, to a description of what you mean by a citizen pilgrim is where you say that a citizen pilgrim participates in the here and now, as well as envisions and embarks on a journey to a desirable future. And so the question that opens and it runs through the book is, what does it mean to participate in the here and now? And I think that what you're arguing for and telling stories about is a contentious participation, right? And it's a particular set of contentions with regard to family, institutions, the roles that others would wish you to adopt, the struggle to define your own role, the relationship to society and the state, and to other people, and especially to, as you said in your remarks earlier, to those who are suffering from the here and now in particular ways. And so to participate in the here and now, I think, requires an imagination of what is the here and now, which is often something that is missing from a lot of the conversation, in the sense that it's easy to limit the notions of what is the here and now and the human experience of the here and now. And so let me kind of follow that up by asking 2 specific questions and making a comment. The specific questions is that you say that no issue for our time, and this is about being a citizen of Richard Falk in particular, a citizen pilgrim, no issue of our time is more ethically compelling for me, given my social location as Jew, American, and progressive humanist, as the plight of the Palestinians and the responsibility of my country and its government for indefinitely prolonging their ordeal. And so it's a way of combining a sense of the identities that you find and are given and the here and now, and how to participate and to contend as somebody located in that particular setting. And so the question then becomes, what is it that you think are the processes that limit that possibility of recognition and participation for so many others who are also, as you would say, have the same location as being a Jew, an American, and a progressive humanist? Right? You talk about your intellectual journey, but there are many other people who share the same locations. And one of the things that doesn't come across are the kind of processes that limit other people from being able to make that same set of judgments. And especially now, one of the things you write at great length in your book is about the work that you've done as in solidarity and engagement with the plight of the Palestinians, being the UN rapporteur on these matters of the human rights of the Palestinians in the occupied territories. And the dismay that you reflect in parts of your book about other American institutions with regard to that Palestinian experience, I'm just wondering how long you think it takes for change to come, because you will have seen and others will have seen that Human Rights Watch has finally issued a report on finding Israel as being responsible for crimes against humanity of apartheid and discrimination against the Palestinians, which in your judgment perhaps would have come much earlier. So I'm just wondering, there's an expectation of how change comes that, I'm just curious as to how you think about that. And this is my second observation, is that you write that ever since the end of the Vietnam War, from my perspective, there has been a downward spiral of political development in matters that interested me most, including US foreign policy, global military arrangements, and some specific issues. And so this sense of disappointment that is there in the notion of the downward spiral. I'm just curious as to how you think about when change comes, it comes quickly. And the downward spiral, in many ways, one could argue, has actually changed its momentum in key ways on some issues much more quickly than many people imagined. I mean, those who thought about the end of the Cold War, in the 70s and 80s, it was hard to imagine that that downward spiral many of us thought would come so dramatically and relatively peacefully to an end. And so I'm just curious about this notion of, this long process of spiraling downwards in the perspectives that you look at and lament. And yet at the same time, there is not just the commitment to turn it around, but also that change, when it comes, can be dramatic and swift and unexpected in all kinds of ways. And so it's that expectation of how the spiral, what else is going on that's at the same time as the spiraling downwards. And the last thing then, I'm kind of struck by this, is that there are issues in the American political and global debate about nuclear weapons playing out today. For example, there are bills in Congress, and President Biden has said in the past that he would support a policy of the no first use of nuclear weapons by the United States. And I remember reading at a very early age an essay written by Dick and others at Princeton from 1961 or 1962 on the case for no first use of nuclear weapons. And, and then in the 1980s, there was work that Dick and others, including his students at Princeton, did on that civil society should just take the initiative and develop a process for the abolition of nuclear weapons through an international legal instrument. And now we have a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons that was agreed at the United Nations in 2017, basically driven by and led by the United Nations and the Global South. So it took, the better part of 40 years to get to, where you were in 1962 and 1981, 82 on these kinds of issues. And so I'm just curious as to how you see the unfolding of that process, because in your book, nuclear weapons barely get a mention, even though they have been such a profound concern for such a long time in so much of your work. And so I was just curious about that.
Thank you. That's fantastic. And Richard, we're going to come back to you. I know you're accumulating questions here. So stay tuned in just a few minutes. And I know we also want to save room for some questions from the audience. Mary, very good to see you. The floor is yours for some comments.
Well, thank you. And it's great to see everyone, especially Richard. So Richard's written a wonderful book, and it's hugely readable. I recommend it. It's full of insights. It's very stimulating. And so it's really difficult to know where to begin. And there are lots of things I would love to discuss. But I think most of those things I'll leave till we meet again, which we will. It's almost impossible to believe that Richard's 90. And what I came to the conclusion is that being a citizen pilgrim keeps you young. I think if you live according to your conscience, then it's a very good recipe for a long and healthy life. It was Richard's mention, actually, at the end of the book of Noam Chomsky that made me think of that. Anyway, I first got to know Richard in the 1980s. I think we'd met before, but we really got to know each other in the 1980s when we were both part of a United Nations university project led by the brilliant political scientist Rajani Kothari called Towards the Liberating Peace, we were supposed to write a book called The Last Child. It was called The Last Child because Gandhi said, you must care about the last man. And Rajni had the idea that it would also take into account the future of the planet if we talk about caring for the last child. But we never wrote the book. And I think both of us feel a bit guilty that we never wrote the book, but maybe it could be our next project in memory of Rajni. Anyway, on this project, Richard was supposed to be in charge of North America and I was supposed to be in charge of Western Europe. And we decided to pool our efforts. And I want to mention it because I think we did two very interesting things. We wrote two books. One was called De-Alignment. And the idea was, instead of non-alignment between the blocks, we were interested in de-alignment, like decolonization, the unraveling of military alliances. And I still think that was a really interesting idea. And the second book was called, which I actually think played a real role in what happened at the end of the 90s. It was called The New Détente. We did it after Gorbachev came to power. And we were able, by using the platform of the United Nations University, to commission articles from some of the leading dissident intellectuals, which I think was really important. It enabled us to support them both financially and politically by giving them this UNU platform. So I was just looking at the contents of the book, and we had Adam Michnik of Poland, Václav Havel, Milan Šimečka, I could go on in the list. And I was able to travel to Eastern Europe and meet them. And I think at the end, we had to invite some of the official intellectuals who were on the board of the United Nations University. We inadvertently ended up organizing a love match between an official and a dissident, which I'm quite proud of. Anyway, what I wanted to say was that at that time, I was going through something very similar to what Richard had gone through in Vietnam. I was going through this transition from being an established academic to being a public intellectual who was no longer considered serious as an academic. I'd been at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. I'd constructed the arms trade statistics, which are still in use today. I was known for my work on the arms trade and military technology. And then I decided to become active in European nuclear disarmament. And overnight, my whole persona seemed to change. I mean, not for me personally, but how I was perceived. I still remember going to the Ford Foundation and somebody saying, we all know the difference between the old Mary Kaldor and the new Mary Kaldor. Anyway, it was wonderful getting to know Richard because he was able to explain all this to me because he'd gone through the same thing. And so throughout my life, really, Richard has been not only my friend and colleague, but my mentor and my role model. And there's so much to admire about what Richard's done in his life. But most recently, I think Zia mentioned his work for Palestine. That has been probably the most courageous thing he's ever done. And the degree of attack that he's had to withstand because of his role has been just unbelievable. And I witnessed it personally when he launched a book at LSE, where we had the most incredible sort of organized protest by pro-Israeli people. I don't want to go on at any length because I want to give Richard a time. I just want to end by talking, I want to end by talking about one aspect of the book. And I think, and it relates to a lot of what other people have said, but it relates to this question of pessimism and optimism about the future, something Richard and I have often discussed. Richard actually ends the book. I've known him be optimistic and I've known him be pessimistic, but he actually ends the book by saying he's an agnostic. And I was very struck by the fact that, of course, he finished the book before the election of Biden. And in the book, he's quite pessimistic about what he thinks Biden will do. I think probably, at least domestically, Biden has surprised us all by the extraordinarily, by the progressive nature of what he's trying to carry out. But what I wanted to say is, and I think this relates to Zia's question too, you know, he was saying, how long does it take? But actually the world goes forward and the world goes backward. And there are sort of moments in the world which are extraordinarily transformative, and moments when the world seems to be staying still. Usually those moments are wars. They're existential crises that are often hugely destructive and where terrible, tragic mistakes are made. But through the process, a learning takes place and very far-reaching changes come about. And I do think that we're living through one such moment. I think the fact that Biden is progressive doesn't have to do with him as a character. It has to do with the moment that we're living through. And I do think this is a moment when Richard's conception of humane governance is so absolutely critical. I mean, we do have global governance, but it's neoliberal global governance. What we need desperately is humane global governance. And I hope your project will be thinking through what that could mean. I just want to mention, I mean, 3 changes that I think are really important and could be significant. I mean, the first is just the economic change. We're already seeing an end to neoliberalism and austerity, whether it's Biden's program or the European Recovery Program. That's an extraordinary change. And we're also seeing the IMF suddenly lending like mad with very different types of conditionality than from before. I mean, I think secondly, very importantly, although the immediate reaction to COVID has been quite nationalistic, and we're seeing this kind of vaccine nationalism, people are beginning to realize that this is not going to solve the problem. I think India, what's happening now in India is hugely significant in this respect. And I think, you know, there is a global treaty on the table. I think we're beginning to realize that it is going to be important to change the rules around intellectual property. We are going to have to vaccinate the world if we're going to solve the problem of COVID. And then finally, something I'm very preoccupied with, I focus on the horrible conflicts in the world, Afghanistan, Syria, and places, and they are transmission belts for COVID. Actually, you know, polio was supposed to have been eliminated in 2005, and it's reappeared in Afghanistan and Congo. And unless we can start taking seriously how to address those conflicts, and there are lots of things I could say about that, that's also going to make it very difficult for us to eliminate COVID. And so all of these global challenges, of course, climate change, I'm not even going to start talking about that for time reasons. So does that mean I think these things will happen? Well, of course, I'm still an agnostic like Richard, and the jury's still out. But I think if it doesn't happen, the future does look very, very grim. A world of grim for the planet, grim for human beings, grim for disease, grim for disasters. And I was thinking actually that there's a little piece by Kant where he says, you know, it's about whether perpetual peace will come about. And he says, well, it could come about by deliberate design, it could come about by chance, but it might not come about. And in that case, a hell of evils, those are his words, will overtake us. So I think that's probably the way to think about optimism and pessimism. And it's really important for all of us to try to be citizen pilgrims in this period.
Thank you, Mary. That's wonderful. Thank you all for your comments. We've got a little bit more than 10 minutes, and so I want to turn things over to Richard. I know there have been some general questions and a couple of pointed ones, more specific, that you probably took note of. So would you like to reflect on what you've heard a little bit?
Well, I'm sort of overwhelmed. Each of you really raised fundamental questions and things that would take longer than we have for me to respond adequately to. And I was intrigued by the fact that so many of the comments at one point or another referred to the Citizen Pilgrim idea. And I would say just a couple of words about it. One is that the reason I originally came to it was I was dissatisfied with the terminology of world citizen, because I felt that world citizen implies that citizenship implies a community, and there is no community. It's an illusion or a sentimental delusion to think that, for instance, the UN is the world community, rather than the aggregation of various state actors pursuing their national interests, so on. So that there is no mechanism for the expression of global interests or human interests, and those values are not crystallized in any meaningful way. And so the idea of Citizen Pilgrim for me was, and as I think Anne-Marie pointed out, the pilgrimage is central to it, the journey, and the journey is to the future. So there's a temporal, the community is to be created. And actually the inspiration for the terminology comes from St. Paul, his letter to the Hebrews, in which he talks about being dissatisfied with the earthly city and wanting to create a heavenly city, as he puts it. And that faith is belief in the unseen. And those elements gave me a kind of inspirational, it was a very personal thing at first. And and it's sort of obscured for a lot of people, opaque, and I'm often asked about what I really mean by that. And I sometimes talk about, instead of using Citizen Pilgrim, I talk about being a patriot for humanity, or a guardian of nature, or something that's much more accessible in that way. But the point, I want to get away from the notion of national citizenship as the prime focus of loyalty. And at the same time, I didn't want to shift to something that was purely sentimental and like world citizenship. And so this was kind of an attempt to bridge that divide, and maybe not. I don't know. It is. I've been glad that some people find it useful, and it's because it's sort of obscure. It sticks out, and people ask about it, and that has. I'm very happy that Anne-Marie clarified her views, and I apologize to the extent that I misunderstood them in the past. But I think this issue of intervention was one of my earliest interests, and much preceded. The first academic event I ever participated in was in Brussels, where I was asked to do a paper on Soviet versus American ideas of intervention. And I gradually came to the view that in the age of decolonization and third world nationalism, military superiority isn't decisive. And so the whole notion of intervening to make things better seemed to me to rest on the postulate of the intervener being able to impose its will, which it was able to do in the colonial period at an acceptable cost. But with the rise of the norm of self-determination and nationalism, the resistance to intervention is much more durable than the patience of the intervener. And so around the withdrawal from Afghanistan, things haven't changed really. I mean, it's a terrible failure in terms of making things better, either from Washington's perspective or from a more humanistic perspective. Things are very much unchanged in their fundamental character. And I think the unlearned lesson of Vietnam is that this declining agency of military power in these internal struggles, and that lesson can't be learned because it means cutting the military budget. So you have to believe that intervention is possible and viable. And so it's a very unfortunate trap for American policy elites, I think, at the present time. I apologize because there's so many important ideas were raised by each of you. And I'm grateful to Dan for emphasizing the planetary perspective and the degree to which this effort to think with others from non-Western countries about the future of the world was a very good learning experience for me, and I think a very good model for trying to understand what makes for change. And it was also true in the project in India with Mary that we engaged in what amounted to a privileged global conversation. And you learn from each other if you're capable of listening. And these were strong. One thing Dan didn't mention is that the African at the table was probably the most eloquent person I've ever known. I mean, they were very strong personalities involved, and that was very important. Ali Mazrui is and as Mary mentioned, Rajni Katari was one of the leading participants in WAMP, and the Latin Americans were extremely good. And even the Soviet and Paul Lin, who represented China, were all, they were all very strong advocates of their own perspectives. And yet we were able to talk together, and there was no real consensus, I would say. And the real entrepreneurial person in the project, Saul Mendelowitz, he was a world federalist, but he was completely isolated from all the rest of us. And so it was, but he had the good grace to do the necessary work to fund the project. So it wouldn't have been possible without him. At the same time, it was a great disappointment to him because of the intellectual character of the participants. And one of the participants was Johann Galtung, who's an eccentric but very brilliant kind of permanent gadfly and structural thinker of considerable stimulation. Zia asked about how one conceptualizes change, and it relates also to what Mary had to say about optimism and pessimism. And I think that one of the things that I've tried, especially recently, to understand is that we can't be content with incremental change, given the challenges that we face in the world. And yet the organization of authority and policy making is organized around the exclusive relevance of incremental change. So that there is an increasing mismatch between what the elites think is possible and what at least people like myself think is necessary and desirable. And it makes me feel that if there is to be change, it will come from below. That I don't see, even with Mary's optimistic comments about Biden, I don't see that as producing systemic change or structural change. I think Biden will never challenge global militarism or neoliberal capitalism. He'll modify it to the extent that there is immediate pressure and a mandate to overcome this grotesque level of inequality that has crept into the system. But I don't think he will do it. He won't be capable of doing anything beyond anything that's structural in that sense. But I was struck by the fact that none of you mentioned the fact that we are stumbling into a new Cold War with China. And Biden and Blinken are leading the way. And the Washington atmosphere is very much, if there is to be bipartisanship, it'll be that kind of geopolitical encounter, that instead of figuring out how to change ourselves so that we can do what China is doing technologically and economically, we think that our impulse is once again to deal with it as a military challenge and to talk, for the first time, the Pentagon people that are talking about we may need to use nuclear weapons because China regionally is likely to prevail if there's a confrontation in the South China Sea or the East China Sea. There's a recent article by a general named Richard, last name, who said the Pentagon war games all show that China wins in a conventional encounter, and that it isn't a matter of possible recourse to nuclear weapons. We have to prepare for a probable reliance on them. So I think that this leads me toward a certain kind of feeling of pessimism. And just one last point on that, I have the eccentric view that the US suffered by winning the Cold War, that it made capitalism unbalanced because there was no longer a socialist alternative that was viable. And that accounts in part for the inequality that has crept into the operations of the world economy and the national economy. I think at every stage of capitalism, when it wasn't challenged, it goes to the extreme. When it's challenged, it tries to accommodate. It's very resilient, and it's been a very resilient system. And when it's challenged, it tries to accommodate. And the European social democracy is the classic example of that, but the New Deal was a different kind of example. So let me stop there and thank you all extremely much and it's lovely to see you all, even virtually, and hopefully it will be existentially possible in months to come.
Thank you, Richard. That's a great way to bring this wonderful gathering to a close. There are questions in the chat, but I think we're going to need to wait on those. We'll have another occasion, hopefully down the road, to continue this conversation. Thank you to you and to our four discussants. Each of you have been fantastic. I think we've all heard how Richard embodied in this new memoir, but more broadly, his ideas and his almost life model as a scholar activist has been incredibly inspiring to all of us in very different ways, each of us coming to Richard's life and his work from different directions, different starting points, but we've all been inspired in very important ways. And your last comment was a bit pessimistic about the future, but maybe that's the point that we have to end on, that there's still a great deal more work to do, and hopefully we will arrive at the point where there will be discontinuities of the sort that you have thought about, where the ideas, the long hard work of rethinking and building coalitions and looking down below for bottom up kinds of change will have an opportunity to assert themselves, because as you have so eloquently said, the planet hangs in the balance. So thank you, Richard, so much, and all the best health to all of you, and thank you again.
Thank you, John. And I just want to say one thing, I still play tennis.
But
I'm so glad to hear it.
Hillel can beat you now.
Thank you, Richard.